Welcome to the second part of this series where I go through every camera I've ever used. In this one I cover the HD era that spans from 2012 to 2019, which is mostly smartphones and entry-level DSLRs. If you're curious about the cameras I used before this period, then check out my video on the 480p era of cameras, which spans from 2004 to 2012. That of course means we will begin this story in 2012 with the camera that replaced the red GEA 1455, the iPhone 4. The iPhone 4 was my first smartphone and it brought an end to the era of me using point-and-shoot cameras. This phone is the camera I used to document life in Sacramento after college. And on my other channel I have a video that covers that post-UC Berkeley period. But more importantly for this audience, it goes into detail of why I eventually caved and entered the world of smartphones. So I'll show you some of my iPhone 4 images while I read you some of the camera specs I pulled from Wikipedia. The iPhone 4 features a front-facing VGA camera and a backside illuminated 5-megapixel rear-facing camera with a 3.85mm f2.8 lens and an LED flash. The rear-facing 5-megapixel camera is capable of recording HD video in 720p at 30 frames per second. After nearly 3 years of use, it was time for an upgrade, primarily because some app developers stopped creating and updating apps for the iPhone. Being cheap, I of course updated to the iPhone 5 despite the iPhone 6 having already been released. This phone documented my move from Sacramento to San Francisco and my early days of life in San Francisco. This phone didn't last very long. It only lasted 2 months because I dropped it in the streets one day trying to hurry across an intersection. Now for some iPhone 5 specs I pulled from Wikipedia. This phone has a rear Sony Exmor R IMX 145, whatever that's supposed to be. It has an 8-megapixel iSight backside illuminated sensor and HD 1080p video at 30 frames per second with an aperture of f2.4. Moving on from my poor shattered iPhone 5 to its replacement, the iPhone 6. Purchased in November 2015 and serving as my phone for nearly 4 years, it's possible I took more pictures with this device than I have with any other camera I've owned. In fact, the images I took during my 1-week trip to Paris alone may have been more than I've gotten out of any other camera. So much so that the collection of images is worth its own feature-length film, which I created. I must say that the 1080p footage that comes out of this phone is actually pretty good. In fact, it was good enough to be my first ever YouTube camera back in early 2019, but you won't see any of those videos because they're on my other channel and they're unlisted. I had this phone from November 2015 to October 2019, and it served as my primary camera until March 2019 when I got a Canon T6i. More on that camera later. I won't read all of the iPhone 6 camera specs, but here are some I pulled from good old Wiki. 8 megapixels True Tone flash, autofocus, IR filter, burst mode, f2.2 aperture, 1080p HD video recording at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, slow motion video in 720p at 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second, time lapse, panorama up to 43 megapixels, face detection, steals from video, auto HDR, and digital image stabilization. It's no wonder why so many people question the future of the DSLR mirrorless industry when smartphones from 2015 have more than enough camera specs for the average person in 2021. The camera on the iPhone 6 was so good that in 2016 I went on a binge of urban hikes throughout San Francisco just to document them visually. This included night hikes, which perhaps showed the advantage of that f2.2 aperture. I also occasionally took advantage of the panorama feature. After years of getting used to the quality, convenience, and ease of use of smartphones, adapting to DSLRs required a bit of taste acquisition. Let's begin with the Canon XSI. I originally ordered this in summer 2018 for my photography class before reading the fine print that the class requires a camera that shoots video. This camera did not shoot video. But in case you're wondering, the Canon XSI, also known as the Canon 450D, is a 12.2 megapixel camera, and it's the predecessor to the next camera on the list, the Canon T1i, which I ordered along with an 18 to 55mm kit lens after returning the Canon XSI. The Canon T1i, also known as the Canon 500D, is a 15.1 megapixel APS-C camera. I probably got a bad copy of this camera because I couldn't get this camera to focus if my life depended on it. I miraculously escaped my photography class with a B-, probably due to my participation grade, because I got C's on just about every photo assignment. All of my images were out of focus, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why some of the other students got everything in focus. It turns out they probably just had cameras that weren't bad copies. This was not a great introduction to DSLR cameras because this camera fooled me into believing they were nearly impossible to use. So this camera permanently went onto my shelf to collect dust the moment my photography class ended at the end of summer 2018, and I continued to use my iPhone 6 as my primary camera. Fast forward to the beginning of 2019 when I somehow got the bright idea to give YouTube a try. After beginning YouTube with the iPhone 6, my iPhone capacity was so full that it became unusable as a video camera. And of course, when you dip your toe into YouTube, you inevitably discover vloggers and learn what they use. I noticed many of the top vloggers at the time were using Canon DSLR, so I bought a Canon T6i. The moment I started using this camera, I got the crispiest images and videos I had ever taken at the time, and did so with very little effort. This made me realize that when I had the Canon T1i, the problem wasn't me, the problem was actually the camera, which is one of the few examples in which a photographer can blame the camera. The T6i era of my YouTube channel produced videos that caused my friends to wonder what camera I used because they wanted to get that same look. Now for some basic specs. This is a 24.2 megapixel APS-C camera that shoots 1080p up to 30 frames per second and 720p up to 60 frames per second. This was my primary camera from mid-March 2019 to early August 2019. During summer 2019, I must have been watching too many vlogs because I began to get captivated by what other YouTubers were doing with cameras. One of those things was slow motion, so I bought a camera that was basically the same as the Canon T6i, but with 1080p that went up to 60 frames per second. The Canon T7i, which might be the camera that began my gear acquisition syndrome. Like the T6i, the T7i has a 24.2 megapixel APS-C sensor, but the T6i shoots 1080p only up to 30 frames per second with 720p up to 60 frames per second, whereas the T7i shoots 1080 up to 60 frames per second. The funny thing is that this slow motion video upgrade is one of the primary reasons I got the T7i, yet I never used that feature. Indeed, that is one sign of gear acquisition syndrome. Another is that the Canon T7i served as my primary camera only from early August 2019 to late October 2019 as other cameras began to come into the picture. But before those other cameras took over, I did get a couple of fun months of shooting while carrying around the T6i and the T7i as my backup and primary camera bodies respectively. This HD era of my camera life began with me discovering the convenience of smartphones and ended with me discovering the quality of devices that are built only to capture images. I took a couple of lessons from this transition. The first is that just about everyone carries around a device that's more than capable of helping them tell the story they want to tell in a social media era in which most visual media is viewed on small screens. The second is that as you learn the art of visual storytelling, your growth as a storyteller can justify the upgrades in camera equipment. This HD era covers 2012 to 2019, and it's towards the end of this period when I began pushing the limits of my vlogging capabilities. I strongly encourage everyone to do this so they could focus on their growth as a photographer and filmmaker before jumping into some of the gear upgrades that I cover in the next part of this series, because it quickly gets pricey.